Hi everyone, this is Nicole Rivera and this is the Stop Writing Alone podcast for writers who are looking for their writing community. I know you want to find readers for your work, but I think your first step is to connect with other writers. That's what we're going to do here in the Stop Writing Alone podcast. We'll do writing prompts and other writing group activities, discover online writing communities, learn how to find local writing groups, or how to make your own. Join us as we explore, learn, and write. Hi, this is Nicole Rivera, and you're listening to the Stop Writing Alone podcast. I want to talk summer reading with you. In a previous episode, I discussed why I had made the personal decision to not, at this point in my life, in my career, go for an MFA, whether it's in creative writing or, a specific genre of writing, which is now offered. It's just not been a thing for me that is something that I'm seeking anymore. And part of the reason that I discussed in that episode was that I felt as though and feel as though I've been doing a decent job of maintaining my own education and growth as a writer. When I first began to discover podcasts as a listener, one of the first podcasts that I was pretty faithful to listening to was Gabriela Pereira's DIY MFA, and she had said 3 components that exist in every MFA program are reading, writing, and community. And I was, that's kind of what I've stuck to, the big pillars that I've been seeking, reading within what you're writing, but also reading about writing. And then obviously the community and Stop Writing Alone and the Happy Campers Club and doing as much writing as I can, So what I wanted to do with you this week, to discuss with you this week, is what that reading is looking like for me this summer, because summertime is a huge reading time for me. It's been like this for years, for most of my life. One is back in the day, when you were in school, you would get your summer reading list, and I was one of those kids that could not wait to get the summer reading list. What are we going to read this summer? This is great. I can't wait to see what are the assigned readings. And I would get so excited because it was like I had this great excuse to buy these brand new books and sit down and read them. As I grew older, I always had more time to read in the summer than I did in the rest of the year because of being a teacher, because of going to college. So summer has always been this space where I've allowed myself to read as widely as possible because it seems like the best time of year to do so. And, that has continued now, especially this particular year with all of the remote learning and my husband remote teaching from home. There didn't really feel like a quiet time to get into my reading in a way that felt satisfactory to me. So I was really clawing my way through all the things that I read throughout the fall and the winter and the spring. And now that all of that daily, hubbub has quieted, reading is back. And part of it is my mom life. I always try to make sure that my son sticks to his reading for school. And so we institute something ever since he's been able to read. In the summers, we institute Rivera Reading Time, which is every Monday through Friday. We sit and read for at least 20 minutes, and we all sit and read together. And so he has his stack of books, my husband has his stack of books, and I have mine. And so one of the things that is happening is that I'm rotating through a bunch of different books, and they're all sort of in this vein of expanding my knowledge as a writer. Well, the first that I just want to tell you about, which really is not necessarily in that world, it is the fiction book that I'm currently reading because of my local writing group, and that is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. I kind of was intrigued by this book the moment I saw it. I don't know if it was the cover. I am a person that buys books based on the cover. The cover was just appealing to me, and then once I read the premise of the book, which is, in short, when you pass away, there's this in-between life and death place called the Midnight Library, at least for the protagonist of this book. She finds herself in this library, and the books that fill the library are different lives. So she can just pick a book off the shelf, and it would be her life at that moment if she had made some different choice at some point in her life. And it's a fantastic read. It's about life. It's about regrets. It's about wishing we had more, or, all of those things. And I'm almost done with it, but I have been enjoying reading that very slowly. Not only because I am just loving everything about the story, but I'm also reading as a writer and asking myself as I go through this, what are the things that are working? What do I like about this? So that's just always important, to always have fiction sprinkled in. And I'll come back to other fiction that I plan to fill that space once I finish that book. But I wanted to sort of put that one out there for you, just in case you haven't read that book or it's not on your TBR list. I highly recommend it. But getting to my writer books and the things that are really, I'm really excited to be reading right now. The first is the 27 Essential Principles of Story by Daniel Joshua Rubin. And of course, I should have said this at the top, I will put links to all of these books in the show notes so that you can, read the descriptions and reviews for yourself. But this book, I think I did mention this on the podcast earlier when I purchased it. I purchased this when I was on that family trip in Florida. My husband actually got it for me. And I love the breakdown of this book. So as the title says, it's 27 essential principles of story. Each idea is broken into a chapter or a section where Rubin takes you through the teaching of the idea and then also shows you how it was done in another story. So let me just grab the book for a second. So, for example, the first chapter or the first essential principle of story was to drop the hammer. And this is like really in the beginning of your book, really bringing in what is the big change that's going to happen to your protagonist. What is this story really going to address? What is the tone of this book? So, and the story that Rubin used to demonstrate this was Hamlet. So I think when I first explained this book to you guys, I knew that was going to happen, that there was going to be examples within. But of course, I hadn't read the book yet, so I didn't know how that was going to happen. I really thought that Rubin was just going to have sections of the book or the stories printed within for us to read and say, here's where it happens. But no, this guy, I love this. First, let me just give you the breakdown. The chapter begins with a quick take, and that's a really quick description of the principle. And then he breaks it down really clearly on how it actually works and why it's an important thing to have in your story. And then the next part says how a master did it. And this guy, tells you the story of Hamlet while also then telling you and here's where the hammer hits, and this is why this is important here. Obviously, just like a teacher would. So I don't know why I didn't think that that's the way it would be, but he has it laid out, and he's like, okay, and then when we go into scene 2, this is what happens, and you'll remember that from scene 1, we had this character really, forlorn and upset. But that's leading us into the hammer, and it just kept going. Scene 3, scene 4, scene 5, all the way through describing the story of Hamlet. So if you haven't read it, it's all there for you. And then he says, now let's go through each element of a well-struck hammer drop and see how the moment Hamlet learns his father was murdered stacks up, because that's the dropping of the hammer, when he learns from the ghost of his father that he was actually murdered. And then he bullet points like every single moment that leads up to that and why it all leads up to that. The next section is, how do you do it? So then, in case it wasn't clear from this point, it's like, okay, I get it, but, I don't know how to do that. He lays it out for you. And then I love this. In every single chapter, there's a mini final exam. He then writes this whole other story scenario, and it's a multiple choice question after the scenario, and it says, which of the following events would drop the strongest hammer in the story? And then it give you choices of things that you could write that would happen next. And then at the end of the chapter, he'll tell you why a certain choice is the best hammer to drop. He also has a little snippet in each chapter of continuing ed, really briefly talking about another story or space where you can see the hammer drop so that you could go and do your own reading. If this is not like an encapsulated education of different elements of story, I don't know what is. I think I'm up to chapter 4 now. So the second chapter was Ask Dramatic Questions, and I think that was the one where he used Finding Nemo. And that was incredible. I mean, it was really, really amazing. So this is one of the books that I'm rotating through. And I'm intentionally, I don't think I said this at the beginning, I'm intentionally rotating through all these books. I'm not sitting down with one book and blazing through it to get to the next one. That's something that I've done in years past. And I find that when I do that, it doesn't stick as well. It's just like, because you binge watch a show, it's over, and you almost forget you watch it by the time you binge watch the next one, right? But if it's, the way television was back in the day, where you were watching a show weekly, episode after episode, and it was a part of your life for this, long season, then you remember more. So this is what I'm doing. I bring my books to Rivera reading time every day, and I just rotate through them. So for the 27 essential principles of story, I sit down and I read one principle of story all the way through. And when I finish that, I pick up my next book. With the Midnight Library. The Midnight Library is the one that I have the hardest time putting down. I have a really hard time reading one chapter and saying, oh, I should read something else. But I've been taking it slow also. So yeah, I highly recommend that 27 Principles of Story. One of the reasons that I decided to pick it up and really go through it this summer is that I'm also thinking about using that book in a new session of Stop Reading Alone. I would love to read it with community. So yeah, just stay tuned, because that may happen. I think it would be a really great book to read and discuss with other writers, just to see, what do you think about how this is done? Are you doing it in your own writing? How could you add it to your own writing? I'm also reading it nice and slow, because I'm taking the elements and bringing it to my novel as I'm reading, because it is kind of in order. Well, at least so far it seems like it's in order. Dropping the hammer is like the first thing we should think about, according to Ruben. Okay, so next book that I'm reading that is writerly is called Storyville. Let me grab it. Hold on. So it's Storyville, an illustrated guide to writing fiction, and it's by John Dufresne, and it's illustrated by Evan Wondolowski. I definitely just butchered that, even though I said it slowly. This book I just picked up maybe last week. I was in Barnes & Noble, of course. I went over to the writing section. I was like, I never saw that book before. And I grabbed it off the shelf. And I just immediately loved it because it's really, I don't know, it's neat, right? The art in it is very plain and I'm not thinking of the right word. It's almost like, oh gosh, forget it. Like icons. That's not the word I want to say. I can't think of it. Anyway, there are little images sparsely within. There are pages that are full page quotes on or about writing or story. There are a couple of exercises within, and you know me, I love my exercises, I love my prompts. But so far as I'm reading this book, what I'm loving is that it feels a little bit more lighthearted than my Essential Principles of Story, which has me thinking very hard and really digging deep on all of my story knowledge. This is really an examination of like all things writing, the writing, the life of a writer. And then, like I said, these nice quotes that are part motivational, part reflection on writing. I also just love the design of this book. Like I said, I get sold on covers, guys. So this is one of those hardcover books that doesn't have a dust jacket. It just is the hardcover, and all of the art and everything is on the cover itself. But of course, if you're going to do an illustrated book and graphics are important, I think the whole design is really nice. It's black and white within. There's not a color book, but just to give you a sense of, I think there is a table of contents here. Yeah, so it's, again, very bare bones on the table of contents. There are 4 major sections of this book, and the first section is the fiction writer, and I'm still within that section. Oh, I might have crossed over into the second section, which is the fiction writing. Then there's the plot, and then there's the revision. So I do think we are going to shift into more serious essays, but that's essentially how this book is kind of broken up into like these sort of essays. And like I said, at this point about the fiction writer, and I just love it because I'm reading it, and it seems like I'm reading stuff I already know. We're talking about the life of a writer. Okay, I do this kind of stuff. But then, get into these little nuances of how the actual medium that we use to write can dictate so many things, and I'm trying to look for that section here where there's a quote. It says, "Our equipment takes part in the forming of our thoughts," and that's from Nietzsche. And then on the facing page, there is then the right stuff, which is essentially an essay that really discusses the idea of like all the various mediums or tools that people have used to write, like John Steinbeck using the black winged 602 pencils and how important that was to him. But then moving on to typewriters, computers, and now cell phones, and talking about the practice of, I think it's Keitai Shoutsetsu, which is basically novels written on cell phones, which is a popular practice in Japan. And I'm like, whoa, I didn't know that. And then that transformed into movellas. So like mobile novellas, which, is something that sort of erupted in Denmark. So it's just like these little snippets of deeper knowledge about things that I didn't necessarily know. And so I'm really enjoying this. Like I said, the graphics I love, the quotes I love. Of course, I love my exercises, but even these little essays are really taking me on these journeys of examining story, and I can geek out about that all day, every day. So that's Storyville, an illustrated guide to writing fiction by John Dufresne, and I recommend it. Another one that I have, which is this ancient book that has been in my house forever. It was not originally mine. You may recall that my husband is a high school English teacher. Therefore, you may have deduced that he majored in English in college. And one of his college books, The Story and Its Writer, which was a collection put together by Ann Charters. Well, this doorstop of a book has been in my house for more than 2 decades. And my husband at one point was like, oh, I should get rid of this. You know, he gets all his short stories that he teaches, like, from online. Why do we have this book? You know, when we're in decluttering. And I nearly tackled him. I mean, this was a couple of years ago. I'm like, no. Let me see that. And I'm going to grab it. Hold on. It's a heavy one. Here's the thing that I love about this book. Aside from, you know, the great number of authors in this book. I mean, you can't see this, so I'm just going to tell you. I'm going to flip to the last page so you know how large this book is. It is, it also has those like really thin, almost Bible-like pages. Okay, I'm not on the last page, but I'm close. It's 1,801 pages, so it's almost 2,000 pages. And this is, like I said, the 6th edition. I believe we were talking about this in the Happy Campers Club, and we looked it up. I believe the latest edition is either the 10th or the 11th. So there may be an even better representation of this. But what this book does, the subtitle is An Introduction to Short Fiction. And for those of you who've been following the podcast, you know that I've been writing a lot of short fiction, starting in 2020, where I gave myself the challenge of 52 short stories in 52 weeks. I did that, so I had 52 stories that I wrote there. And then I've just sort of fallen in love with the form. I've fallen in love with the idea of writing short fiction, being able to get beginning, middles, and ends all together in a much shorter time period than when, you know, you try to sit with a novel or a novella. So it's been great that I've been writing all this, but I haven't really studied it. This book is part of that practice, because what the book has is the story, as it says, and its writer. So there's a blurb about the author of the story. It's more than a blurb. I mean, it's like a history about the writer, and then you get one or two of their stories that you can read right after that. And there's some of, you know, the bigger writers and more popular stories that have been shared among, again, like I said, my husband was like, I don't need this. I can find these stories all over the place. But I like the organization of getting that little story about the writer so that you can kind of see, in some cases, how it connects to the creation of the story or where they're coming from. So this is a behemoth of a book that I've been going very, very slowly through. And I am curious about the more recent edition to see if there are newer authors included. But for now, I am going to continue to muscle through this one. So that's The Story and Its Writer by Ann Charters. I think it's a Norton book. Is it Norton? Oh, this says it was published by Bedford St. Martin's. I assumed it was Norton. Silly me. So that's another one for all of you short fiction writers. You know, we can seek out short fiction in so many different spaces. And of course, I think there's so much value in reading very current stuff. And if you haven't heard now I'm going to forget the name of it, but I'll put a link in the show notes. The New Yorker magazine also has a podcast that's similar to this book of the story and its writer, because what they do on their podcast is that they have, the New Yorker publishes short fiction. And what they do is they have the writers of that short fiction read their own stories for the podcast. So I love listening to that. So that's another one to check out. And that would give you a sort of tap into very current short fiction, if that is your jam. So I've got one more book that I'm rotating in my Rivera reading time. And that is another book that's been around in my house for a really long time, that was given to me by a fellow writer, by my friend Nancy Canoe, who I did interview previously on the Stop Writing Alone podcast. She's the co-organizer of the Staten Island Writers Group, but she's also a freelance editor. And she, is, I've said it time and time again, she's like one of the greatest people to have, read your stuff as a critique, because like she's finding things you haven't even thought of. She has so much experience with doing editing all the time that it's just like comes second nature to her. So after, years of us working together, she's like, there's this book that I want you to have that I think every writer should have. And she just brought it to me, and I've had it and I've flipped through it a couple of times, but I've never sat down to really read it. And this year in particular, it feels like it is time for me to really get into this book. So let me grab it. The book is called Thanks, But This Isn't For Us. Subtitle, A Sort of Compassionate Guide to Why Your Writing is Being Projected. And this was written by Jessica Page Morell. So why do I say this is the year that I should be writing this? Last year, my 2020 challenge was to write 52 short stories in 52 weeks, and I accomplished that. The 2021 challenge that I put before myself was to submit 52 stories in 52 weeks. And I have not held up to that challenge as well as I did with writing the stories. So partially because the writing of the stories was linked to my YouTube channel, there was a little bit more of accountability for me, to a constant reminder of, Nicole, you got to write a story. You're getting behind here on your 52. And by this time in the year, I was a little bit behind, but not so much that I couldn't catch up. When it comes to the submissions, however, I am at like a standstill. I don't even know how many I'm up to. I feel like it's around 10, and I think we're in week 25 or 26 of the year, something like that. We're like at the halfway point of the year. So that's not good. And this book is all about that process. It's Thanks, But This Isn't For Us is about our writing. But whereas the 27 essential principles of story are really about, putting the story together, drafting it, putting in these story elements that are going to, really glue everything together. This book, Thanks, But This Isn't For Us, now is going to take me to those last steps before submission. Like, what are these things that I need to double check and look at? What is the final sort of coat of paint I need to put on before I send things out? And of course, there's going to be some elements in here that mirror the other books, because we are still talking about writing. But what's interesting to me is that this book has sort of this combination of talking about those essential points of craft, of, writing story, what I mean when I say craft, and also then that nitty gritty stuff about like, I'm just flipping here, the final edit, fixing your manuscript without losing it. And then, there's this whole section on driving an editor crazy, goofs, gaffes, and howlers that sink a manuscript, right? So we have like this back and forth between writing with emotional potency is one chapter, and then the fixing of the manuscript at the end. So yeah, I'm just getting started with that one, so I will let you know how that goes, but it's come highly recommended. I shared it with a couple of the writers in the Happy Campers Club, and one of our writers, Sarah, got it immediately, and the next meeting we had, she had Post-it notes sticking out of every corner. She's like, this book is amazing. So yeah, that's when I was like, oh my gosh, Sarah already bought it and got into it, and I barely cracked the spine. It's time that I get to it. So that is pretty much my my plan for and what I've been doing. It's not just my plan, but it's what's been happening here in my summer reading. In addition to whatever my book club will pick next, the Wise Words of the Woods book club that I'm doing with Kim Floden, where we're reading Byron Katie's book. And then to fill, that's, my book club will fill in part of my fiction gap, but also I am a subscriber currently to Owl Crate Jr., which is not, I used to subscribe to Owl Crate, which is a subscription box for YA readers. And I love that because I love to write YA, I love to read YA. But they also started a book called Owl Crate, a book box called Owl Crate Jr., which is geared towards middle grade lit. And I've been very curious about where middle grade lit is today. And that's the one thing that I love about Owl Crate is that they always put very current books into their boxes, and they sort of keep you in the know about those genres. So I'm sorry, those categories. So I will also be continuing to read my middle grade lit books. I have one here that I cracked into that I am loving. That's Cece Rios and the Desert of Souls. That is a really interesting book. And I think I have like 3 others that I haven't started yet. The Elephant in the Room was the first one that I got, and I love that book. So I am really sort of falling in love with this middle grade genre, which is timely for me. My son is 7, so he'll very soon be reading these books. But the question is, will I very soon be wanting to write these books? So those are my plans for fiction, to catch up on my Owl Crate Jr. books, to read what's happening in my book clubs. And that's about it. But I hope that you got some new ideas for what you could be reading this summer, if summer is your reading time. If it's not, right, then you can just jot this all down and get it ready for whenever you're reading. But yeah, The Midnight Library, Matt Haig, love it. 27 Essential Principles of Story by Daniel Joshua Rubin, loving it so far. Storyville, the Illustrated Guide to Writing Fiction by John DeFresney, is just a real easy but wonderful read for writers. The Story and Its Writer, the collection put together by Ann Charters, I think is a really important book for anybody into short fiction. But do yourself a favor and get the latest edition. And then Thanks, But This Isn't For Us by Jessica Page Morell. Definitely a book to get on your shelf for when you are ready to submit. And if you're already there, then, start reading. But that is it for now from me. I hope you enjoyed this extensive list of the books that I'm reading. It's one of those topics, guys. You get me start talking about books, I'm going to go on and on and on. So I was thinking about, I did tell you that I wanted to do a call-in episode coming up. And there was this series, since we're talking about books, there was this series that I used to run on my blog many, many years ago. Rivera runs through it. And it was called Book Love. And what I did is I asked people to, if they wanted to be interviewed or to write their own essay on their first ever book love, that either had them fall in love with reading, or even back then I was connecting with many writers, or the first book that made you want to become a writer. So back in the day, I asked people to show up on my blog, and I would either interview them or they would write it for me. Now I have a podcast. So I'm going to ask you to call in with your book love answer. What was your first book love that helped you fall in love with reading or fall in love with writing? You choose whichever direction you want to take it in. Think if you can get back as far as possible. When I actually wrote 2 answers to this because I realized that I didn't go far back enough. My first time I answered what was my first book love, I said Tales of the Fourth Grade Nothing by Judy Blume, because it was the first book that I fell asleep with on my face, and it would crack up in the night, and I would sneak read. I had one of these old-fashioned lamps that had a nightlight in the bottom, and I have horrible vision, and it could have started then. As I would pretend I was going to sleep and then read in this dim light. Oh, that book was amazing. Loved it because I related so much to the character the protagonist, who was from New York and had a little brother, just like me. So I thought that was my first book love. And then as I started to get other people's answers and I started to think more and more about what was my first book love, I realized it was, there's a monster at the end of this book. Oh, why did I forget the author's name right now? Oh my goodness, it's in the office. The book with Grover. And anybody that's a child of the 80s knows exactly what book I'm talking about. But that was another book that was just so fun, so interactive. I really felt like the page that was layered in bricks was so much heavier than the other pages. And it was just so much fun to read, and just all of these pieces of paper put together took me to this space of humor. And one of my favorite characters, I was a big Muppets girl. I still am. So Grover was there, and I could hear his voice in my mind as I was reading it, but I could also feel every bit of emotion on every page. And I don't know at this point if I had ever felt that before. It's possible. That may have happened before, but to this day, that is as early as I can go, that was my first book love. And I still love that book, and I can still read it and still crack up. So what was yours? I think for some of you, it might be There's a Monster at the End of This Book. I won't name names. But if you don't remember the phone number for the Stop Writing Alone, call in. Is it a hotline? I don't know. It's 646-907-9607. And you could just introduce yourself and tell us about your first book love. And it'll record right there. And that would be freaking awesome. I want to talk books all the time. And if it helped you want to become a writer, I'd love to hear about that. Alrighty, ladies and gents, that's it for me today. Have a wonderful week. Happy writing, happy reading, and I will talk to you next Thursday. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the Stop Writing Alone podcast wherever you're listening to this episode today. Then connect with us on Facebook at Stop Writing Alone Facebook page, or in the Stop Writing Alone with Nicole Rivera Facebook group. check Instagram or Twitter, where I'm @NV_Rivera, to find links to our email newsletter.